A team of American researchers working in the high mountains of Turkey have uncovered what appear to be hidden tunnels similar to the descriptions of the biblical account of Noah's Ark.
Evidence of Noah's Ark may have been found, and it changes everything. High over the mountains of eastern Turkey, a NATO captain glances down through the glass of his cockpit and sees something that freezes him in his seat. Something that should not be there. Something no boat in history should ever be sitting on.
The story of Noah's Ark is told in the biblical book of Genesis.
He lifts his camera, he takes a single photograph, and when the film is developed back at base, the technicians go silent, because the shape captured on that strip of film is about to revive a mystery the world has been trying to solve for thousands of years. The impossible photo. Pinar is flying for NATO. His mission is straightforward and, by every measure, completely routine. Take aerial photographs, map the terrain, update the records. A few years earlier, 3 massive earthquakes had hammered this region and reshaped the ground itself. Cliffs had collapsed, hillsides had slid. Whole sections of the landscape had been rearranged overnight. The Turkish government wanted fresh images of the area, and Pinar was the man assigned to bring them home. For most of the flight, there is nothing unusual to see. Just rock, just earth. Just the endless folded skin of the Anatolian mountains stretching out in every direction. He is flying, in essence, over the middle of nowhere, and that is where the shape appears. Down below, scattered across a barren slope at staggering altitude, is a formation. Not a hill, not an outcrop. Something with edges, something with symmetry, something that almost looks like it was placed there. He takes the photograph and continues the mission. When the film is developed back at base, the technician who processes it goes quiet. Then Pinar himself sees the image, and the air seems to leave the room. Because what is captured on that strip of film, sitting alone on a Turkish mountainside more than a mile above sea level, is the unmistakable outline of a massive ship. A ship, inland, at 6,500 feet. The shape is enormous, long, tapered at one end. Its proportions are not random. Its proportions are familiar. Its proportions, when measured against the photograph, line up almost exactly with the dimensions of a vessel described in a text written thousands of years ago. A vessel built by a man named Noah. Pinar does not yet know what he has stumbled onto. He does not yet know that this single photograph, this one accidental glance from a NATO mapping flight, is about to revive the most haunted question in human history. A question religious scholars have circled for 2,000 years. A question that links the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, and the oldest written stories on Earth. Did the Great Flood actually happen? And if it did, is the proof sitting right there, on a mountain in Turkey, hiding in plain sight? What makes this case so hard to dismiss is the location. The formation is not down in a river valley where some old wreck might have been carried by water. It is not on a beach. It is not anywhere a boat could have been left by ordinary means. It is on a high mountain ridge, in a region where there has never been a sea, surrounded by nothing but stone and wind. The only way an object that size could end up in that place is if something carried it there. Something enormous. Something the geology of the region has no easy explanation for. And the answer, when researchers finally start digging into it, is far stranger than anyone expected. The story that won't die. To understand why one photograph from 1959 set off a global firestorm, you have to understand the story that photographs seem to confirm. And it is a story that almost every culture on Earth has told, in one form or another, for thousands of years. In the book of Genesis, the story opens with creation itself. God forms the heavens and the earth. He makes humanity, beginning with Adam and Eve. Generations pass, cities rise, people multiply across the land. And 10 generations after Adam, a man named Noah is born into a world that has gone deeply wrong. By Noah's time, the text says, humanity has slipped into something dark. Violence is everywhere. Cruelty is everywhere. Sin has spread until it covers the world like a stain. And God, looking down at the creation he once called good, decides he can no longer watch it continue. He decides to start over. The plan is total. Every living thing on the surface of the earth will be wiped clean by water. Every person, every animal, every settlement. The slate will be wiped, and the world will begin again. But Noah is spared. The text says he is the last righteous man left in a corrupted age, and God gives him one chance to save himself, his family, and a remnant of every living creature on the planet. He must build an ark. The instructions Noah receives are not vague. They are not poetic. They are, in fact, almost industrial in their precision. The ark is to have 3 decks. It is to be made of a specific kind of wood. It is to be sealed with pitch inside and out. It is to contain rooms and compartments, and its dimensions are spelled out exactly. 515 feet long, 86 feet wide, 51 feet tall. These are not the dimensions of a fishing boat. These are the dimensions of a freighter, a vessel built to survive something on a planetary scale. Then the rain comes. For 40 days and 40 nights, the text says, water falls without stopping. The fountains of the deep break open. The seas rise, the rivers swell. Every valley fills, every plain disappears, and eventually the highest mountains themselves vanish beneath the surface of a world-spanning sea. When the waters finally begin to recede, the ark drifts to a stop. It comes to rest, the text says, on the mountains of Ararat. And here is where it gets impossible to dismiss, because there is a real mountain called Ararat. It is not legend, it is not metaphor. It is a real, physical, snow-capped peak that towers over eastern Turkey to this day. It is one of the most distinctive mountains in the entire region. And Durupinar's photograph, the one taken in 1959, the one showing a ship-shaped formation impossibly far from any sea, is taken just a few miles south of it. For centuries, religious scholars treated the flood story as moral theater, a parable, a warning, a way of teaching that wickedness invites destruction. Most academics assumed it was symbolic and moved on, but the story would not stay quiet, because the same flood appears in the Torah, the same flood appears in the Quran, the same flood, in slightly different form, appears in the religious memory of cultures from Mesopotamia to the Americas. Different gods, different names, same catastrophe, same survivor, same boat. And now, there is a photograph of something boat-shaped, at 6,500 feet, a few miles from the one mountain on Earth where the Bible says the ark came to rest. Coincidence is one explanation, but it may not be the only one, because the next question researchers asked was not whether the boat was real. It was whether the flood itself left a fingerprint somewhere on the planet that science could actually find. And what they discovered at the bottom of the Black Sea changed the conversation forever. The flood that rewrote Earth. If a flood of biblical scale really happened, it would not vanish without a trace. A catastrophe that size would tear up coastlines. It would reshape valleys. It would bury entire ecosystems. It would leave a fingerprint in the sediment, in the rock, in the bones of the animals that drowned in it. So, in 1997, a team of scientists set out to look for that fingerprint. They were led by 2 American researchers, William Ryan and Walter Pittman. The team included geologists, geophysicists, and oceanographers. And they did not begin in Turkey. They began at the bottom of the Black Sea. What they found there should not have been there. The Black Sea today is salt water. It is part of a marine system connected through narrow straits to the Mediterranean. Every drop of water in it is salty. Every fish in it is a saltwater fish. That is just how the Black Sea works. Except down at the bottom, buried in the mud, the team kept pulling up something strange. Shells, bones, remains, and not the remains of saltwater creatures. The remains of freshwater animals, snails, mussels, fish, the kind of life that only survives in lakes, dating back to roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years before Christ. The bedrock told the same story. The soil samples told the same story. The chemistry of the deepest layers told the same story. The Black Sea at one point was not a sea at all. It was a freshwater lake. And then, in something close to an instant on the geological clock, it changed. The theory that emerged is staggering. Around 8,000 years ago, the team proposed an enormous glacier somewhere on the planet collapsed. The collapse triggered a cascade. Sea levels surged. The Mediterranean, swollen far beyond its usual height, broke through the natural barrier, separating it from the freshwater lake on the other side. What happened next is almost impossible to picture without flinching. Every single day, the equivalent of 200 Niagara Falls came roaring through that gap. 200 Niagara Falls. Not for an hour, not for a week, for 300 days straight. The water did not trickle in. It exploded in. The freshwater lake, the one that would one day be called the Black Sea, expanded by roughly 1 mile a day. 1 mile every 24 hours. Day after day, the shoreline retreated, and behind it the water followed, climbing up valleys, swallowing forests, drowning villages. If you lived in this region at this moment in history, your life had a very short clock. You could be standing in your home in the morning, and by nightfall, your home could be underneath the surface of an inland sea. There was no warning. There was no high ground to run to that the water would not eventually reach. There was no horizon left, because the horizon itself had become water. You would have heard it before you saw it. A roar in the distance that did not stop. A roar that grew louder every hour. A roar that did not belong to any storm anyone in your village had ever lived through. By the time you understood what it was already too close. By the time the flood finally stopped, the new sea covered an area roughly the size of Colorado. An entire human civilization, scattered across a fertile basin, was simply erased. Their fields, their tools, their buildings, their burial sites. All of it pushed into the dark, hundreds of feet beneath a brand new ocean. But here is the part that should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. There were survivors, not many. Not enough to repopulate, but enough. Enough to flee outward in every direction. Enough to climb to higher ground. Enough to pass down, through generations of campfires and oral history, the memory of the day the world drowned. These were people who had no written language yet. They could not record what happened. They could only tell their children, and their children could only tell their children. And the story, like all stories that survive that long, slowly grew in the telling. A flood that rose at 1 mile a day. A flood the size of a state. A flood that went on for almost a year. The researchers behind the Black Sea deluge theory believe this was the seed, the original event. The one true catastrophe that fractured into 100 different flood stories across 100 different cultures, with one of those branches eventually flowing into the book of Genesis itself. If you are still with me, hit subscribe so the next chapter of this investigation does not pass you by. And drop a comment below. Do you think the flood was real? The Attic Tablet. In 1985, in England, a man named Leonard Simmons passes away. By all accounts, Leonard had lived a remarkable life. He had served as an officer in the Royal Air Force. His career had carried him across the world, especially around the Mediterranean basin, through ports and cities most people only ever read about. And like a lot of curious travelers, he picked things up along the way. Small artifacts, strange stones, pieces of places he had been. When he traveled, he brought them home. When he died, those artifacts stayed behind in a quiet collection in his house. His son, Douglas Simmons, knew most of them only as oddities, items he had grown up looking at without understanding. So once in a while, he would pick one out of the pile and bring it to the British Museum to ask the experts what it actually was. One day in 1985, he walks into the museum carrying something small, maybe 4 inches tall, covered, front and back, in tiny wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform, the writing of ancient Mesopotamia. The man Douglas ends up sitting across from is Dr. Irving Finkel. Finkel is the chief curator of the Near Eastern Artifacts Department at the British Museum, and he has spent his entire adult life learning to read tablets exactly like this one. He has held thousands of them. He has translated thousands of them. He knows when something is ordinary, and he knows instantly when something is not. He starts reading, and almost immediately his expression changes. Because the tablet in his hands is not a list of grain shipments. It is not a tax receipt. It is not a temple inventory. It is a story. And the story is about a flood, a devastating flood. A flood. That ends with a survivor and a boat. Finkel asks if he can keep the tablet to translate it fully. Douglas declines. He wants to take his father's artifact home. But Finkel is, at this point, a man who has just glimpsed something extraordinary and has no intention of letting it go. He has reason to be excited. The British Museum's collection of cuneiform tablets is staggering, 130,000 of them. Most were unearthed in 1852 in what is now Iraq, the heartland of ancient Mesopotamia. They are humanity's oldest paper trail. Most of them are mundane, records of how many ducks were needed for a feast, receipts, letters, lists. But buried in that mountain of bookkeeping is one of the oldest stories ever written down. A poem about a king named Gilgamesh. And what that king's story says about a flood is something you have to hear to believe. The older story, The poem is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was written somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. That makes it older than almost every religious text that mentions the flood. It was already ancient when Genesis was first set down. And here is the catch. It tells, in startling detail, the same story. The Epic of Gilgamesh follows the adventures of a powerful king who ruled in ancient Mesopotamia, an area near modern-day Iraq. Within the larger poem, there is a smaller embedded tale, a story within the story, and it begins with the gods deciding to wipe out humanity with a great flood. A man is warned. A man is told to build a boat. A man is told to bring animals aboard. A man is told that the world is about to end. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, that man is not called Noah. He is called Utnapishtim. He is described as immortal, having survived something no other man has lived through. He gathers animals. He builds an ark. He rides out the catastrophe. And when the waters finally pull back, his boat comes to rest on a mountain. The mountain in his story is not called Ararat. It is called Mount Nisir. And get this, the structure of the story, beat for beat, matches the story of Noah so closely that scholars have been arguing about it for over a century. The warning, the boat, the animals, the flood, the mountain, the survivor. Even some of the imagery, including the release of birds to test whether the waters had receded, appears in both versions. But the real bombshell is the timing. The Epic of Gilgamesh was written down at least 1,000 years before the book of Genesis, possibly more. The flood story in the Mesopotamian tradition predates the flood story in the Bible by centuries. So now we are left with a question that no one has fully answered. If the same flood story shows up in Mesopotamia, then in Israel, then in Greece, then in India, then in nations across the Americas that had no contact with any of those places, different gods, different names, different languages, separated by oceans and millennia, what exactly are all those cultures remembering? What if it is not a story at all? What if every one of them is describing the same real event from different angles, in different tongues, after the memory had passed through so many generations that the names came loose, but the catastrophe stayed? Lying on a desk in the British Museum in 1985, a 4-inch tablet from an attic in England started whispering the same story all over again. A story that may have begun in the same Turkish highlands where, decades earlier, a young captain in a NATO reconnaissance plane looked down and saw the impossible shape of a ship. And the man closest to that shape today is not the captain who first saw it. The mountain won't let go. Here is the thing about İlhan Durupinar. After that 1959 flight, he never let it go. Not for the rest of his life. The captain who took the photograph spent decades returning to that ridge in eastern Turkey, climbing it in person, walking the length of the formation, pacing out its dimensions on foot, and comparing them, line by line, against the measurements in Genesis. 515 feet long, 86 feet wide, 51 feet tall, the shape on the ground matched, not loosely, not roughly. Closely enough that Durupinar himself, a NATO captain trained to read terrain for a living, became convinced that what he had photographed from the air was not a quirk of geology. It was a vessel. People who knew him in those later years say the man was haunted by it. He went back when the weather was clear, and he went back when it was not. He brought instruments. He brought witnesses. He brought, more than anything, a refusal to let anyone tell him the shape on that ridge was just rock. The mountain, in a way, had taken hold of him and never quite let go. He died still believing that. The ridge is now informally named after him, the Durupinar site. And here is the part most people do not know. He was not the only one who came back. In the years that followed, expedition after expedition climbed that ridge. Researchers from around the world, engineers, archaeologists, Christian explorers, skeptics, every one of them looking at the same shape on the same mountain and walking away with a different answer. Some teams ran ground-penetrating radar across the formation. They reported anomalies underneath the surface, symmetrical lines, suggestions of internal structure that should not exist in a natural rock formation. Soil samples taken from inside the outline came back with chemistry that did not match the surrounding Earth. Other geologists came in, looked at the same data, and shook their heads. They said the shape was a syncline, a natural fold of rock pushed up by tectonic pressure. Coincidence, they said, nothing more. So the ridge has become a kind of permanent stalemate, a mountain that will not give a clean answer either way. But here is what keeps researchers coming back. It is not the formation alone. It is what the formation sits next to. Mount Ararat, looming a few miles to the north. The Black Sea, a few hundred miles to the west, with a flood event recorded in its sediment that erased an entire civilization. A 4-inch tablet sitting in the British Museum, written by people who lived just to the south, telling the same story before the Bible was written. And get this, the flood story is not just Mesopotamian and biblical. The Greeks told a version of it, where the survivors are named Deucalion and Pyrrha, and they ride out the deluge in a chest. Hindu tradition tells of Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat before the waters come. Indigenous nations across the Americas, separated from any of those cultures by entire oceans, carry their own flood traditions, with their own survivors and their own arcs. Stories that should have nothing to do with each other, told in languages that share no roots, all somehow remembering the same shape of event. Why would so many separate cultures land on the same story? One answer is that catastrophe is universal. Floods are not rare on a planet that is 70% water. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami did it. Hurricane Katrina did it in 2005. The history books are full of similar erasures, going back further than writing itself. But the other answer, the one Durupinar held onto until the day he died, is harder to walk away from. That somewhere in the deep past, something really happened. Something so large that the people who lived through it could not stop talking about it. Their grandchildren told it, their grandchildren's grandchildren told it. And eventually it ended up on a clay tablet, and in a Hebrew scroll, and in a Greek poem, and in an oral history whispered around, a fire on a continent the original survivors had never heard of. And in 1959, a young captain in a Turkish plane looked down through his lens at a ridge in the middle of nowhere and saw, perhaps, the last physical echo of that memory still sitting on the side of a mountain. Was it really Noah's Ark? The investigation has never fully closed. There is a formation on a mountain in eastern Turkey that should not look the way it does. There is a flood, recorded in the geology of the Black Sea, that erased a civilization in less than a year. There is a story, written in cuneiform on tablets older than the Bible, that describes the same event with the same survivor and the same boat. And there is a tradition, repeated across nearly every culture on Earth, that says the same thing happened in the same way at roughly the same time. Each one of those things, on its own, can be argued away. All four lined up together, pointing at the same region and the same shape of event, becomes harder and harder to wave off. Coincidence, taken too far, becomes its own kind of evidence. If you made it this far, do me one last favor. Hit subscribe so the next Ararat update does not pass you by. Drop a comment and tell me what you think really sits on that mountain, a trick of erosion, a relic from before recorded history, or the Ark itself, waiting patiently for the world to be ready to look at it, because the story is not finished, and the next chapter may already be waiting for someone to find it.